to maybe 25 Celsius. Through this evening, I think we'll see a bit more clouds spilling northwards into parts of the Midlands. A few more of these showers developing over the Channel Isles, spreading up from France across southern England into parts of the southwest. Could see some heavy ones. A rumble of thunder is possible too. Much of northern Britain staying fine. Another pretty chilly one actually through some sheltered Scottish glens. Temperatures getting well down into single figures. On to Friday's details. Generally much more cloud across England and Wales. And that weather front up to the northwest we saw earlier will be making gradual encroachment into the Western Isles of Scotland. A little bit of rain for Northern Ireland. Could be quite heavy by the end of the day. A scattering of showers again for England and Wales. Again, one or two of them heavy, but many places avoiding them, staying dry with some sunshine across eastern England. Temperatures getting into the mid or even high 20s in places. So quite warm and humid. And that humidity may then spark some heavier, possibly thundery showers across parts of the south later on Friday afternoon and into the evening. And look at this, low pressure is definitely developing and becoming the dominant feature through the weekend. Slow moving bands of rain across Scotland and Northern Ireland, but we'll all see some showery rain as we go through Saturday and Sunday.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, they get, their ducks in order. Really.
Yeah. Moment now, Boris Johnson will be making his final major speech as Prime Minister, and of course we will bring you that live. We're also going to look at his legacy more broadly with his critics and his supporters, his highs and the challenges he faced. But first, it is your news update.
Good afternoon, it's coming out to 1 minute past 12. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Millions of households could face the biggest squeeze in living standards in over a century. The Resolution Foundation says the number of people living in absolute poverty is set to rise by 3 million in the next few years. The think tank adds that real household disposable income is on course to fall by 10% over the next year. This year and next year. The government says it's preparing to provide extra support once the new Prime Minister's in place. Conservative MP Mark Harper says Rishi Sunak plans to tackle inflation if he gets the job.
gripping inflation and not doing anything that risks making inflation worse. And his concern is that large unfunded tax cuts promised by his opponent in this contest would actually make inflation worse. That's not going to help families. So his focus is get inflation down, inflation that's being driven by global events, but get that down, stop it becoming embedded in the economy. That's how you help those 14 million families have a better quality of life.
Shadow Secretary for Business and Industry Jonathan Reynolds says businesses should be given relief to prevent knock-on effects to customers.
So the starting point should be cutting business rates. We would increase the threshold for small business rates, relief to £25,000. So you're immediately getting help and hope to people that there will be some relief on the bills they've got to pay. Say the fertiliser plants in this country, they're not running. They can't afford to run. So you're putting into next year the inflation, the cost of food going up even further because they can't operate because fertiliser will therefore be more expensive.
Liz Truss has hinted at further cost of living support this winter should she become Prime Minister. Writing in The Sun today, the Foreign Secretary claims if she gets the job, there'll be no new taxes, nor will there be energy rationing. Mr Sunak and Ms Truss took part in the final leadership hustings in front of Conservative members in London last night. The vote closes at 5 p.m. tomorrow. Boris Johnson will deliver a speech in the next couple of minutes or any moment now on the country's energy future. It's thought the outgoing Prime Minister will announce his government's decision to help boost homegrown energy supplies and reduce exposure to international price spikes. It comes amid speculation the government will give the sign-off for the Sizewell C nuclear plant in Suffolk. A British man has been killed whilst volunteering as a medic in Ukraine. Craig McIntosh died last week. His sister Lorna says he was killed in the line of duty. A fundraising page has been set up to bring his body home. The Foreign Office says it's supporting the family and are in contact with local authorities. Renewed shelling has delayed a team of inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency heading to Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Conditions at Europe's largest nuclear site have been unravelling for weeks. Moscow and Kyiv have blamed each other for nearby shelling, fuelling fears of a potential radiation disaster. The IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, says the team are aware of the risk posed by increased military activity in the area. The Russian president won't be attending Mikhail Gorbachev's funeral on Saturday. The Kremlin says Vladimir Putin paid his respects to the last Soviet leader this morning at the Moscow hospital where Gorbachev died earlier this week. The UK Disasters Emergency Committee has launched an appeal to save and protect lives after millions have been left devastated by floods in Pakistan. The DEC, made up of 15 UK charities, is urging people to donate whatever they can to help relief efforts, with 6 million people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. Earlier this week, the United Nations appealed for £138 million in emergency funding. Dr Hamid Khan says more than 2,000 people are believed to have died in the disaster already.
Suffering is unimaginable, and it is a very catastrophic situation. At the moment, 1/3 of Pakistan has come under the flood, which is more than the entire United Kingdom. And if you look into the entire situation, it is very critical, and Pakistan needs a lot of more help.
And tributes are being paid. Right, we're going to cross live to Suffolk, where the outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson is giving a speech on the UK's energy future. Let's have a listen.
The staff and some of the young people who are going to be working here, already are working here. Now, when I was a child, I had a wonderful book, a much-thumbed Ladybird book called The Story of Nuclear Power. It was published in 1972. And I used to go through it again and again, and I was enthralled to read how scientists split the atom here in the UK for the first time. And they did it at the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge. And I noted that the world's first civilian nuclear reactor, the first civilian nuclear power station, was at Calder Hall in Cumbria, now of course Sellafield. And I look back at the optimism that you see on every page of that book, and I look at what has happened since, and at the short-termism of successive British governments and their failure to do justice to our pioneering nuclear history and their abject failure to think of the needs of future generations, above all of the families that are today struggling with the cost of energy in this country. And I feel like one of those beautifully drawn illustrations in that Ladybird book of what happens in a nuclear pile when the graphite rods are taken out at the wrong moment and my blood starts to boil and steam comes out of my ears and I think I'm going to melt down. And I ask myself a question, what happened to us? When Sizewell opened in 1966, it was the 8th reactor that this country had built in just 7 years. Why have we never got back to that kind of rhythm? Have we lost the gumption and dynamism of our parents and grandparents? It gets worse. When Sizewell B, fantastic white dome, was completed in 1995, it was the 5th reactor in 7 years. Now remember 1995, an era that was technologically so primitive that people used to use things called car phones and went down to Blockbusters to rent VHS videos. Think of the colossal technical progress in other areas and contrast the paralysis in British nuclear energy. How many new nuclear power stations have we built in the 27 years since? How many have been connected to the grid? How many slices of bread can we toast with the additional nuclear power we've created? How many washing machines can we power? How many families have been helped with extra nuclear energy? The answer is none. Zero. Zilch. The French, who have loads of nuclear power stations already, have built 4 more since 1995, bringing their total reactor fleet up to about 56. The Indians have added about 12. The Chinese have built more than 50 additional nuclear reactors since 1995. And you know why we failed? It's not even as though we have some cultural aversion to nuclear power. I mean, I just met those nice protesters outside. It wasn't kind of Atomkraft Nein Danke. There wasn't some lefty thing. They seem to be objecting to the disruption to the roads. It's pure NIMBYism out there. That's not the issue. I will diagnose the problem. It's called myopia. It's called short-termism. It's a chronic case of politicians not being able to see beyond the political cycle. For 13 years, the previous Labour government did absolutely nothing to develop this country's nuclear industry. They said it didn't make economic sense. I think they even said that in their manifesto. Well, thanks a bunch, Tony, and thanks a bunch, Gordon. Tell that to British businesses and industries that are now desperately short of affordable and reliable electricity. Tell that to families that are struggling with the cost of heat and light this winter. And they're not the only culprits, because in the run-up to the 2010 election, as you'll have seen, famous video on YouTube now, Nick Clegg, the then leader of the Liberal Democrats, now some kind of tech lobbyist in California, I understand, said that the UK shouldn't build more nuclear power stations like Sizewell C. And he didn't say it was unsafe. He didn't have what he called a theological objection. He said that the problem was that it wouldn't even be completed. No point starting it, he said, because it wouldn't even be completed until, guess when? 2021 or 2022. So, gee, thanks, Nick. And it's because of that kind of myopia that here in the country that first split the atom, we have only 15% of our energy from nuclear and of our electricity from nuclear, and it is falling. Whereas in France it is at 70%, and we ask ourselves why France is more self-reliant than ourselves when it comes to energy, and why they find it relatively easier to hold down costs. Yes, nuclear always looks, when you begin, it always looks relatively expensive to build and to run. But it is, look at what's happening today. Look at the results of Putin's war. It is certainly cheap by comparison with hydrocarbons today. In fact, if Hinkley Point C were already running this year, been delayed for ages and ages, of course, it would be cutting fuel bills by £3 billion. I'll say it again. If Hinkley Point C were running now, it would be cutting our national fuel bills by £3 billion. So you have to look ahead and you have to beware of the false economy. If you have an old kettle that takes ages to boil, it may cost you £20 to replace it. But if you get a new one, you'll save £10 a year for every year on your £10 a year every year on your electricity bill. And I remember when the government finally did the deal on Hinkley C. In fact, I think I was already sitting in the cabinet, and I remember some people protesting then about the strike price that we did, £92.50 per megawatt hour, per kilowatt hour. It was very, very expensive. But it doesn't look very expensive today. That's why we need to pull our national finger out and get on with Sizewell C. That's why we're putting £700 million into the deal, just part of the £1.7 billion of government funding available for developing a large-scale nuclear project to final investment stage, FID, in this Parliament. And in the course of the next few weeks, I am absolutely confident that it will get over the line. And we will get it over the line because it will be absolute madness not to. This project will create tens of thousands of jobs, but it will also power 6 million homes. That is roughly a fifth, 6 million homes, roughly a fifth of all the homes in the UK. So it will help to fix the energy needs, not just of this generation, but of the next. A baby born this year will be getting energy from Sizewell C long, long after she retires. And this new reactor is just a part of our great British nuclear campaign. We will build a reactor a year again. We will build them across the country, at least 8 of them, large ones and small modular reactors. And of course, they're not the entire solution to our energy needs, far from it. Yes, we are increasing our own domestic hydrocarbons. We've got more gas out of the North Sea this year than last year, considerably more, 26% more. We're putting a big bet, as you know, on hydrogen, on carbon capture and storage. And because of the activism of the government, we're now racing towards our target, and we will hit it, of 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. 50 gigawatts is a huge amount. I mean, that's roughly half the electricity consumption of this country from offshore wind. And I tell everybody who thinks hydrocarbons are the only answer, we should, get fracking and all that. Offshore wind is now the cheapest form of electricity in this country. Offshore wind is 9 times cheaper than gas. I'll say it again. Offshore wind is now 9 times cheaper than gas because of the insanity of what Putin has done. And that's why it makes sense for us to become more self-reliant. And of course, it's entirely clean and green. So renewables are not only helping us to defeat climate change, they're also helping to keep bills lower now than they would otherwise be in this crisis. What Putin has done is to launch a kind of kamikaze attack on the world economy. He doesn't care how much pain Russia suffers. He believes that ultimately we will flinch, that Western politicians don't have the stomach for the fight. He believes that we will give up on Ukraine, give in to his aggression, and go back to mainlining his hydrocarbons. And I have to tell you, he is wrong. He's wrong in his assumption about the British people. I think he's wrong in his assumption about other European governments too, by the way. I talked to Olaf Scholz last night, and it's absolutely clear that Germany is resolute in moving away from dependence on Russia. And Putin, in this strategy, is going to fail. So we're helping people now with the cost of living, and of course there will be more cash to come, whoever takes over from me in the months ahead. Substantial sums, that's absolutely clear. But even more important than that, our British energy security strategy, Great British Nuclear, is rectifying the chronic mistakes of the past, taking the long-term decisions that this country needs. And I would say, frankly, folks, over the last 3 years that this government has done some pretty difficult things, and we've done some of the hardest tasks that you can set politicians. We fixed our relations with the European Union. We settled that argument pretty conclusively. We got Brexit done and took back control of our lawmaking, even though we knew it would not be easy. We opened up our economy post-COVID faster than any other major country because of the speed of our vaccine rollout. We led the whole of Europe in helping the Ukrainians and in standing up to Putin, in seeing the wisdom from the start, in arming them and assisting them. And at every stage in the last 3 years, and I hope I can say this, given this one will be one of my last speeches in this office. At every stage, what we've tried to do is put in the things that this country will need for the long term, to try to look at what future generations will need for their prosperity, their productivity, and for their quality of life, and to reduce the cost of living as well. So whether that's gigabit broadband gone up from 7% penetration to 70% of premises now, 3 new high-speed rail lines, investing massively in this country's ability to make its own vaccines, fixing social care, coming up with a solution for that problem. I think it'd be fair to say this government has not shirked the big decisions. We've raised our eyes, we've looked to the horizon. And I just say, whoever follows me next week, I know that they will do the same. So no more national myopia, no more short-termism. Let's think about the future. Let's think about our kids and our grandchildren, about the next generation. And so I say to you with the prophetic candour and clarity of one who is about to hand over the torch of office, I say go nuclear and go large and go with Sizewell C. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Right, thank you all very much. And listen, we're going to take some questions from our friends in the media. We've got Andy Bell from Channel 5, who I've just seen in the second row.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Andy Bell, 5 News. You just said that substantial sums will be coming for helping people with their energy bills. A lot of people will be looking at what you've announced today and say that's not going to help me in the short term, but you've said substantial sums will be coming. Is that just wishful thinking on your part, or have you discussed it with either the people who may be your successor? And would you like to take this opportunity to say, whoever might follow you, you must go ahead and offer targeted, real help to people in the short term with their energy bills? OK, thanks, Andy, very much. I know that you'll have heard this, but it is vital that people remember that more money is coming anyway over the next few weeks and months. So by October, you're going to have another £650 going to 8 million vulnerable households. By the autumn, 29 million homes, that's virtually every home in the country, will get £400 to help with the costs of energy. Every pensioner is going to get £300. Everybody that receives disability benefit, and that's about 1 in 10 of us now, is going to get another £150. So there are chunks of money that are going to keep arriving in people's bank accounts. But what is clear from what both candidates have been saying is that come the new administration, there is going to be a further package that is going to be announced. And clearly, we have the fiscal firepower to sort it out. And one of the reasons for that is because, in spite of the difficulties that we've had, particularly in spite of COVID, we do have a robust employment situation. We have the revenues coming in to the exchequer that will enable us to help people. We've got unemployment down to about 3.8%, which is really pretty low. We talk about the Britain in the 1970s. It hasn't been as low as that since I was a kid. And that gives us the strength to continue to support people. But what I'm trying to say today is we've got to do that, but we've also got to look at the medium and the long term. And that's where we failed as a country. We've got to be absolutely brutally honest with ourselves. And now is the time, not just to put in the wind and all the other renewables, not just to do the hydrocarbons, but to remember the vital importance of nuclear in the baseload. And the Great British Nuclear Strategy will take us back up to at least 25% of our electricity coming from nuclear. It's got to be done, and that's I know that the next leader, whoever he or she may be, will also want to deliver that as well. Camilla Turner, Telegraph.
We know the COVID inquiry is coming up, which may well define your legacy. When you look at the excess deaths, the problems that children are facing in schools and the delays in our justice system, do you think enough attention was paid to the trade-offs of lockdown? And looking back, would you do the second lockdown again?
Yeah, Camilla, I just think it's very important when people look at this, and I've read some of the commentary that's appeared in your distinguished pages on this matter. It is very, very important for people to remember what the measures to restrict the transmission of COVID were trying to do. We had at the peak of the pandemic, we had about 40,000 people or more in NHS beds, and the NHS has a total of about 100,000 beds. And we knew that if you had another 20,000, 30,000 more, and it could easily have happened mathematically in the NHS, the system would have been overwhelmed. And what would have happened then is that all those cases that you've just mentioned, all those people who didn't get the help that they wanted with their cardiac concerns, with their cancer diagnosis, all those other health conditions that you've just described, they would have been pushed out even further to the right. And people would have got, the NHS would have been in an even worse position now to deliver the help that's required. So what the government is doing instead is mounting a massive campaign to cut the COVID backlogs. We're putting in all the 100 community diagnostic hubs. We're investing hugely in the NHS now to help people get the treatment that they need. I appreciate that delays in A&E are very severe, and the ambulances are backing up, but that's why we're funding the reforms of social care. And that's why we're trying to help people, get out of the acute sector and into the place where they can be treated better. But I just come back to, I think there's a sort of inversion of logic going on. People are now saying too much lockdown caused the current problems in the NHS. I'm afraid to say that the opposite is the case, in the sense that if we hadn't locked down, if we hadn't tried to prevent the spread of disease, then the problems we're facing now in the NHS would be even worse. And I really urge people just to think about the logic of what they're saying. Natasha Clark, The Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd just love to know what your advice might be to the millions of Brits that are going to be struggling with their energy bills this winter. What should they be doing? Should they be turning down the heating, putting on a jumper? Is there anything words of comfort you might wish to say in your last final moments as Prime Minister? And we'd love to know, do you have any regrets about your time in office?
Yeah, okay. Natasha, so look, on the second thing, I'm going to leave that to you, because I'm sure I'm sure that you won't. I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure that younger, fitter, more active journalists than me can readily uncover a couple of things that you might think we got wrong if you really put your minds to it. But I think on the whole, I'm very proud of a lot of the things we did. I think that we had some very tough things to deal with, and I think on the whole, the country's come through them very well. We have now, to get to your point, of course, families up and down this country are going to face a very tough winter, and we just have to accept that. And I think that what I would say to people is that the government really, really understands the difficulties that you are facing. We totally get it. I want to go back to the things I said to Andy about the measures we have in place to reassure people that more is coming, that we're on your side, we're going to do everything we can to help. But also, I think what I would like to get over to people is the sense of the future that is going to be better once we become more nationally self-reliant, once we have a British energy security strategy in place that delivers long-term sustainable electricity, energy for our people. And that is ultimately how to fix this problem. So I think what I would say to people is, look, I know it's going to be tough, and I'm sorry it's going to be tough, but once we're through it, we'll be in a much better state. And the out of this catastrophe of Putin's war, I think good is going to come, in that Europe will wean itself off Russian hydrocarbons. We will no longer be vulnerable to his blackmail. And in this country, we will have greatly accelerated long overdue reforms and steps to become energy independent, in particular by rectifying the damage we've done to our nuclear industry. Sam Lister, Express.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Given that you mentioned in your speech about the decisions that haven't been taken on energy, do you regret not developing fracking more enthusiastically? Obviously, there was a moratorium on fracking, which you seem to soften on recently. And also, given it is your last few days in office, David Cameron disappeared quite quickly and has remained very low profile. Theresa May is an assiduous backbencher. What kind of ex-Prime Minister should we expect you to be?
Sam, look, look, on the second thing, I think only time will tell is my answer on that one. But my intention, and what I certainly will do, is give my full and unqualified support to whoever takes over from me, and otherwise, really to get on with life. But on fracking, I'm not intellectually, morally opposed to this at all. I think that if we could frack effectively and cheaply in this country, that would be a possibly a very beneficial thing. I'm just, I have to say, slightly dubious that it will prove to be a panacea. And that's all I would say. I would much rather that we focused on the things where we are brilliant and where the environmental damage is really minimal, like offshore wind. I mean, did you pick up just now? What can I ask you if you can remember how much cheaper is offshore wind than gas? 9 times cheaper. So I kind of rest my case. We are brilliant at offshore wind. We need to put in sustainable baseload in the form of nuclear. Of course, we need a diversified policy, and where local communities want different solutions, they should be allowed to go for different solutions. But I don't think that that particular solution is going to be the panacea that some people suggest. We can be flexible, but we shouldn't put all our eggs in that particular basket. Antonello Guerrera, La Repubblica.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Speaking about nuclear power, how much concerned are you about what is going on around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine, and how close is the risk of a nuclear catastrophe? And secondly, still about Ukraine, as you mentioned the topic in your speech, we are seeing a counter-offensive of Ukrainians starting for Kherson. Do you assume this might be realistically a turning point to regain Crimea and other occupied Russian territories and push Russia out of Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Antonello. Look, first on Zaporizhzhia, I think it's very important to understand this is a huge plant, and it delivers a large proportion of Ukraine's electricity supply. I think it's entirely legitimate of the Ukrainian government to want to take it back in as an effective a way as they can from Russian control. But it's clearly the objective of the Russians, about which they're absolutely, I think, explicit, is they want to unplug it from the Ukrainian grid and plug it into the Russian grid. And there are much greater nuclear experts than me in this room. I'm told that has all sorts of risks. Doing something like that, we don't want to take any risk with Zaporizhzhia. I think it's important that Mr. Grossi and the IAEA are allowed to get in and do their inspection. But I've got to tell you, I think that Zaporizhzhia is a Ukrainian plant, and the Ukrainians should have it back in their control. And on your point about what's happening in the south, in Kherson, everybody should not minimize what the Ukrainians have already done. It is astonishing what they have done. They have repelled the Russians from Kiev. They've driven them out of huge tracts of territory that the Russians had occupied. The Russians are making absolutely glacial progress insofar as they're making any progress at all. They are not winning, and they are not going to win. And that is the crucial thing. Whatever happens in Kherson or in the Donbass, it's vital that we, friends of Ukraine, in the UK or in other parts of Europe, stay absolutely rock solid, steadfast in our support for the Ukrainians. So we shouldn't allow our support to be in any way conditional on what happens in Kherson. Though obviously, I hope and pray that the Ukrainians are successful in what they're doing. It's their country, and as I've said many times, I've never seen a clearer case of right and wrong. They have an absolute right to defend it and to expel the Russians from the territories that they've occupied. Andrew Sinclair, BBC East.
Prime Minister, many people will welcome the commitment you've given to Sizewell today. But do you accept that when it comes to promoting nuclear and wind, there are also many people who worry that your legacy for this part of the country will be to completely change it with dozens of new substations and lots of pylons cluttering up the countryside? Is this the price East Anglia has to pay?
Well, thank you, Andrew. And I know that I could see your wonderful local MP, Tiz Coffey, in the front row, who's good enough and diligent enough. She's mentioned all this to me herself, even though she's a strong supporter of what the government is doing. Clearly, we've got to make sure we do this sensitively. And I saw the protesters outside. I disagree with them. I think they're wrong. I think that the disruption that they're going to experience, it will be short, and it will be worth it for the country. Worth it. Think of those 6 million homes that are going to have electricity as a result of this incredible project. Think of the difference it will make to people in this country. And when it comes to East Anglia's position in offshore wind, it's formidable. And it will. Yes, we've got to make sure that we bring the cables ashore in a way that is environmentally friendly and all the rest of it. But it will drive high-wage, high-skilled jobs here in this part of the country, as well as being part of a clean, green future for this country. So I would be very surprised if the majority of people actually didn't strongly support this approach. So I appreciate there's always going to be dissent, and there's always going to be objectors. That's the nature of democratic politics, as I've discovered. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Boris Johnson there in his last major speech as our Prime Minister. Let's talk now to our panel, Kevin Maguire and Andrew Pearce. Some quick reaction from our wonderful duo, who will be appearing any moment now. Until we can see them, I can tell you that he ended the speech by saying, "Go new." Oh, hello, gentlemen, thank you. Andrew, we haven't got too long. I want to start with you, though. Should the Prime Minister, who will not be in the job in a couple of days, even be making a policy speech?
Well, you see, he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't, because Kevin Maguire is going to come on now and say, oh, we don't know what the Tories are going to do about the cost of living crisis. This trust bank is making policy.
Oh, Andrew, I think we've got a little bit of a problem with your sound. Just bear with me a second. Kevin's smiling at that prospect. Do you know what I noticed while listening to Boris Johnson's speech there? He's optimistic, isn't he? He always paints a picture of a brighter future. Is that a quality you would recognise in him, Kevin Maguire, from the Mirror?
Yeah, it's a fake boost to him, isn't it? He's trying to convince people that he's going to make life better for them when he hasn't. Just look at his record on the economy. We had incredibly low growth, and he's left us with soaring inflation and the biggest squeeze on living standards for 100 years. Now, not all of that is entirely his fault, but the government's slow reaction to it certainly is. And you're right, he's talking about policies he's not going to be around to implement. He's trying to revise opinions of him. We mustn't forget he has been kicked out by Conservative MPs who got sick of his lying and his incompetence and general uselessness, and they feared it would cost their seats. And Andrew's saying, well, he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't on policy. What we really want to hear is what Liz Truss is going to do about the burning issue of energy bills. We have silence on that too. But no, he's trying to rewrite history, Boris Johnson. He's been kicked out by those who knew him best, because they feared he would cost them a general election. He has a lousy record. He was utterly untrustworthy. He's damaged the integrity of politics and Parliament. So I'd say good riddance and goodbye. You might go on this taxpayer-funded ego trip around.
All right, OK, Kevin, let me bring Andrew back in to balance the debate a little. Andrew, actually, I'd just like to take you to the future, to take you to what happens on Monday. Liz Truss is clearly the favourite. You must know her. I mean, you're a very senior journalist. Just tell us a bit about her style, about what you think she will be like as our Prime Minister if she emerges victorious, as we expect.
I think it's not if, it's when. She is, some people think, is she going to be another Theresa May? She's not another Theresa May. She's got a much clearer view about policy. She's on the Thatcherite wing of the party, if you can still call it that. She's quite clear about, she's quite clear in many issues on that. What she isn't is charismatic in the way Boris Johnson is. She's not a great speaker. In fact, she's a pretty poor public speaker, although I think she's got a lot better during the hustings, but she has had plenty of practice. But I suspect after the glamour and the pizzazz and the boosterism of Boris, Gloria, actually perhaps the country wants something a bit more sober, a bit more sober-suited, a bit more serious, which is certainly Liz Truss, because we're in very desperate, deep economic times. And I think she is a serious woman for serious politics. And Kevin goes on and on and on that she won't give us a detailed plan. It would be presumptuous of somebody who's yet to be declared Prime Minister to announce last week or even today what she's going to do in her first budget. That's not, she can't do that. It's not appropriate. It would be unconstitutional. We've only got to wait until Monday, Tuesday. By Wednesday, she'll have hit the ground running. And she knows the scale of the problem. All these MPs have postbags. They know how bad it is for families struggling to pay the cost of living crisis, food bills, energy bills. And I think actually it's rather reassuring that the Prime Minister that we've got just before he's going is announcing this major new attempt to try to get to grips with our energy crisis, albeit in East Anglia, which is right in Liz Truss's backyard.
We're going to have to leave it there. It always makes me sad to say farewell to you two because I enjoy your insights so much. Kevin Maguire from The Mirror and Andrew Pearce from The Mail. Cheers. Thank you. Well, Boris Johnson's energy announcement today marks his final major speech as Prime Minister. It's certainly been an eventful premiership. Britain standing up to Russia over its war in Ukraine, getting Brexit done, and of course a global pandemic in which the UK led the way in creating the first reliable vaccine. But Boris Johnson leaves office amid a cost of living crisis, and there were also the scandals within Number 10, one of which led to the Prime Minister receiving a police fine. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, takes a look back at the highs and lows of Boris Johnson's career.
I have just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, who has invited me to form a government, and I have accepted. The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again. The people who bet against Britain are going to lose their shirts because we're going to restore trust in our democracy.
As a child, he wanted to be king of the world, and for a time, Boris Johnson was indeed Conservative Party royalty. Imperious in his ambitions and commanding in his successes, getting Brexit done and vaccinating the nation. But for the people of Britain, that crown has now slipped. Dethroned over his failures, the victim of a coup of his own making. In many ways, he was an unlikely Prime Minister, a career built on a series of colourful media stunts.
Who says we can't organise gold medals?
Many of them planned, others less so. An everyman appeal, people seemed to overlook his privileged education at Eton and Oxford. He had a talent rare in politics. To be able to laugh at himself.
I'm so sorry. Are you okay?
But many weren't laughing. He was dogged by claims he was unfit for the office of Prime Minister. A charlatan, a joker, more interested in power than governing. A man of no conviction, said his critics, from cosmopolitan London mayor to a tough on-borders Brexiteer. And then there was his personal life, unconventional, that must be said for a Prime Minister. Married 3 times, a father to at least 7, a serial adulterer who once was locked out of his home by a former wife to the glee of the waiting paparazzi.
Covering the fields with their car parks, they dominate the landscape.
He started his career as a journalist, quickly embroiling himself in a string of controversies over, among other things, made-up quotes. But his exuberance, particularly in criticising the European Union, was getting him noticed. He became a regular on the BBC show Have I Got News for You?
Boris Johnson.
And by 1999, he was the editor of The Spectator. But now Boris Johnson was a celebrity. And in 2001, he was elected Conservative MP for Henley. He later supported his long-term frenemy from Oxford, David Cameron, to the leadership of the party. But Boris Johnson's political ambitions went well beyond Parliament. In 2008, he was elected as the Mayor of London, an unlikely Tory leader for a Labour-supporting city. He took on bendy buses, promoted cycling, his famous Boris bikes, and championed a global cosmopolitan London. And his star rose even further, achieving the status of an international figure as London hosted its enormously successful Olympics and Paralympics in 2012. Boris Johnson was by now a global name, with many thinking he was a Prime Minister waiting.
Boris Johnson is duly elected.
3 years later, he was back in Parliament, re-elected as an MP for a West London seat.
Thank you very much.
Many saw it as a direct challenge to David Cameron's Remainer premiership, and it was. The question of Brexit was now consuming Britain, and Boris Johnson was torn. He famously drafted 2 articles for The Telegraph, one in favour of leave, another backing Remain. Ultimately, after a career ridiculing the EU, he decided to put his money where his mouth was and support Brexit.
The last thing I wanted was to go against David Cameron or the government. But after a great deal of heartache, I don't think there's anything else I can do. I will be advocating vote Leave.
The Leave campaign was scrappy, divided and deadly effective. With Johnson as its mascot, if not its leader, its rallies were electric, harnessing the superstar power of the Boris effect. Culminated in a sensational win for the underdog campaign and a pivotal moment in British history with reverberations around the world. Cameron was out and the race to be the next Prime Minister was on. But it was now that Boris Johnson's luck seemed to have run out. Betrayed by his close friend Michael Gove, who launched his own bid for number 10.
Having consulted colleagues and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
Theresa May's premiership got off to a strong start. Party united and energised by her tough talk on getting out of the EU. For Boris Johnson, he found himself a step closer to the throne, appointed Foreign Secretary to the derision of some. For a while, Mrs May seemed unassailable, but her backbenchers plotted, suspicious of the former Remainer in number 10 and critical of her approach to a Brexit deal with Brussels. A snap election was called to boost the numbers of her allies in Parliament.
Strong and stable leadership.
But it was a disaster. May now led a minority government with a civil war in her own party. Boris Johnson, champion of the Brexiteers, sensationally resigned.
It is not too late to save Brexit.
Mrs May's deal with Brussels was quickly falling apart. By the summer of 2019, May was out, and Johnson got his second opportunity to grab the keys to number 10. This time, he was unbeatable, and despite a concerted Stop Boris campaign by Tory Remainers, he sailed to victory, supreme in his popularity among the party base.
Therefore, I give notice that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
But Mrs May's supporters were now the rebels, and deadlock in the Commons over a Brexit deal continued. The new Prime Minister, who'd promised to get Brexit done, called another snap election. And voters clamouring for an end to the Brexit saga and deeply suspicious of Labour under its hard-left leader, Jeremy Corbyn, granted Boris Johnson a landslide. With his promises to level up the country, he smashed the so-called Red Wall, those historically Labour seats in the Midlands and the North, which had always seemed unwinnable to the Conservatives. Weeks after that election victory, Boris Johnson kept his promise to voters by getting Brexit done, a Christmas trade deal with the EU.
The noes to the left, 234.
Though for some that deal was a sellout, opening up a new border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But that triumph was short-lived. Worrying stories of a new virus from China started to emerge. Entire cities locked down to stop the spread. Soon there were desperate reports from hospital front lines in Italy. Case numbers were soaring, ICU wards overwhelmed. And then the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, arrived in Britain.
Morning.
Johnson's initial response appeared to be keep calm and carry on. The apocalyptic tones of reports from elsewhere would not happen here. That's what the line seemed to be.
I think 20 seconds would be sufficient.
Happy birthday.
But inevitably the Prime Minister's cheerful libertarianism collapsed in the face of relentless briefings from his scientific advisors.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much.
Any hope of a policy of herd immunity was gone.
And I thank you all.
Boris Johnson gave an order to the British public that he'd never envisaged.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
He had hoped it would be a short-term measure. Britain would become a world leader in test and trace, we were told. A vaccine was on the way, the Prime Minister insisted. But then the unthinkable happens. He was hospitalised with the virus. Reports emerged that the Prime Minister was on a ventilator. There were whispered conversations in Whitehall that he could be about to die. For a few hours, it seemed that no one was in control. Boris Johnson did, however, recover, and for those among the public yet to encounter the deadly effect of coronavirus, well, the crisis really did seem more real. The virus was becoming better understood, and at a boost to the Prime Minister, Britain beat the world to a reliable vaccine, produced at cost price by AstraZeneca with research from Oxford University. And when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, Britain again led the world, standing up to Russia's aggression.
How are you? Nice to see you. I'm very, very, very glad to see you.
The Prime Minister was lauded in Kyiv and globally for sending weapons, money and support. To Downing Street's delight, the Kremlin effectively labelled him enemy number one. But it was the actions of the Prime Minister's staff, and indeed Boris Johnson himself, which sealed his fate in the minds of the public. First, there was the infamous lockdown-breaking trip to Barnard Castle by the Prime Minister's fearsome advisor Dominic Cummings, with his bizarre half-apology. Then it emerged that Number 10 had hosted garden parties, birthday cakes, quizzes and suitcases loaded with booze. There was the smirking admissions of festive parties, just as people were told not to see their loved ones at Christmas.
And it was not socially distanced.
And the damning evidence that the Prime Minister himself and those closest to him had broken the COVID rules they themselves had set. Multiple investigations were launched, including by the police, with more than 120 fines issued, and Boris Johnson becoming the first ever sitting Prime Minister to find to have broken the law.
I understand the anger that many will feel that I myself fell short when it came to observing the very rules which the government I lead had introduced to protect the public. And I accept in all sincerity that people had the right to expect better.
Crises followed like London buses. There were stories of drug abuse and porn watching by Tory MPs. Boris Johnson's time seemed to be running out. He was damaged by a narrower than hoped confidence vote.
That the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
And devastated by an onslaught of by-election losses. And then his final mistake. Accused of lying after claims of sexual assault were made against a colleague. An avalanche of resignations followed, culminating in his own.
And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
For Boris Johnson's long-term critics, It ended as they always said it would. A joke figure, deeply unsuited to high office, thrust into one of the most serious crises Britain has ever faced. But for supporters, he was precisely what the country needed. A breezy, sunny optimist who took on the establishment and won. A patriot who truly believes in the potential of Great Britain. And a conservative who smashed the red wall. How history will remember him will depend on the coming months and years. But for now, Boris Johnson's party is finally over, and the hangover has just begun.
That was our political editor looking back on a very eventful career. So what is Boris Johnson's legacy? To discuss this, I'm joined by Stephen Fielding, Professor of Political History at Nottingham University, and Dr Sam Blackland, Research Fellow at the University College London. Good to see you both, gentlemen. You both have different political perspectives, but you're both experts in your field. Steve, I'm going to start with you. Legacies are always complicated. So in your view, his biggest achievement and perhaps the darkest stain?
Well, his biggest achievement is undoubtedly Brexit. Whether you think that was a good thing, a good Brexit, we are still living through the consequences of that deal. So that's you can't take that away from him. He got Brexit done, except of course he hasn't, has he? Because it hasn't really been properly resolved. So that's really going to be the standout thing. And whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, you can debate that. And I think the worst thing, the darkest thing about Boris Johnson's legacy is that he took blagging and bluffing to stratospheric levels. I think he's proved to be a bit of a toxic element in our political culture, sort of lying in a way. He didn't invent political lies, but he took it to such an extent. And the rule breaking, he has done things that no other prime minister would have even countenanced doing. He even broke his own rules. So I think that may be the longer term consequence. Do politicians learn from what he did and try to continue that? Or do they learn from the fact that he actually was brought down by his own misdeeds, finally at least, by his own MPs?
And that's an interesting perspective. We note your hell yes, I'm voting Labour T-shirt in the backdrop, so we know where you're coming from. Sam, same question to you. The biggest high, the darkest stain?
Well, I agree with Steve that the getting Brexit done is the big achievement. And we forget, it seems like such a long time ago now, but 2017, 2018, the beginning of 2019, British politics was paralysed. It was fun for us to watch it in some ways, but the whole political system was just completely logjammed because of Theresa May's minority government not being able to get her Brexit deal through. To come in, to call a snap election, to gamble on that, to win it, and then actually to get some form of Brexit done, which indeed is a very messy one, was a really substantial political achievement, and Boris Johnson deserves credit for that because it was done very personally. The biggest drawback, I think, is something that we're not going to see yet. I think that we have to think about this, and Steve and I have to do in some ways as historians, thinking in the long term. I think that the secondary consequences of lockdown, some of us were saying this very quietly at the time, probably not loudly enough, and some people were sort of hinting at it. But the secondary consequences of lockdowns to educational sort of standards, to people's mental health, but also to things like inflation, because when you pump money into a totally sort of shut down economy, you're going to get sort of inflation. People were saying that at the time. I think in the long run, we'll look at the way that lockdowns were handled. And far from the very fashionable view now, which is that Boris Johnson didn't lock down fast or quickly enough, we might actually end up thinking that lockdowns have huge consequences, some of which, not all, but some of which are worse than the effects of COVID in the first place.
Sam, I'm going to stick with you because I'm interested in both your perspectives on whether we have seen the last of him, because he doesn't follow the conventional rules of politics. Have we seen the last of the politician, this senior politician, Boris Johnson? Some people think he could make a comeback. Sam?
Well, we've not seen the last of him just in public life. I assume he'll go to have a lucrative column, probably in the Telegraph again, and we'll see him as a pundit all over the place. We might well see him. I think he is a remarkable politician in some ways. Everything that Steve said about him is right. He's flippant, he's frivolous, there's sort of a sense that he's winging stuff, but he also has an ability to connect with people, people who call him by his first name. People across the country, that sort of fragile coalition of sort of so-called red wall voters, but also sort of leafy suburban voters who seem to warm to him to some extent. And he has an ability to communicate. He has that sort of way of even breaking the fourth wall when he's in television interviews and looking down the camera. He is basically the Oliver Hardy of British politics, for good and for bad. And people like that and sort of like the jolliness. And I would suspect that just one thing, if you look at the polling before Boris Johnson was kind of forced out, he wasn't doing terribly amongst the public. And I think that's indicative of the fact that he still has some cachet amongst not just kind of Tory members, who obviously still like him, but amongst parts of the general public too, much more than I imagine Liz Truss will.
I'm going to come in because I want to give Steve Fielding the final word. We've got about a minute left. Steve, have we seen the last of Boris Johnson as a senior politician?
I think so. Many Conservative members would love him to still be in number 10. They don't really think he should have been forced out. But I think the British public will not countenance him coming back. He was never as popular as many people think. He was important in 2019, but he wasn't the decisive element in bringing the red wall to the Conservative Party. And I think he really has damaged whatever positive element he might have brought to the Conservative Party by his own actions. I mean, that's the worst thing you could say about him, that he brought himself down by his own actions, and he's been exposed for the joker, the clown that he really has been.
You two are great talkers, provided some great analysis there. Please come back on the show and on the channel soon. Thank you, Steve Fielding from Nottingham University and Sam Blaxland from University College London. Thank you. You have been watching or listening to The Briefing with me, Gloria De Piero. Thanks so much for your company on this show. I'll be back on Monday. You'll be seeing even more of me. I'll be presenting a new show along with Mark Longhurst called GB News Day from 12 to 3, Mondays to Thursday. I can't wait to get started. See you on Monday.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.